I'd like to first start off by saying thank you to Father Bill and his congregation for hosting us today. And thank you to my Unity Center family for pushing me to stand here today. Although my family and I's emotional state is frantic, filled with sleeplessness and devastation, I realize that it is my duty to speak to you today, as it is the least thing that I can do to be my people's voice while they are under fire, many of whom are taking their final breaths as we speak. To provide you context about the Gaza Strip, where my family lives, the Gaza Strip is a strip of land on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. It is 25 miles long, 5 miles wide. It is comparable to the size of the city of Detroit, with only 2 entry and exit points, the Egyptian Rafah border from the south, and the Israeli Erez border from the north. It is one of the most densely populated cities in the world, with a population of nearly 2.3 million people. Almost half, 47%, being under the age of 18 years old. This is how Gaza coined its name, the world's largest open-air prison. You might wonder why the population is so young. Since 2007, Gaza has been under a complete siege through land, air, and sea blockade. Many Palestinians simply don't get the chance to grow old, dying in their early adulthood, either in conflicts or due to a struggling healthcare system. The 16-year blockade has hampered fast access to medical care and caused shortages of essential supplies like gauze and IV bags. Preventative care is basically non-existent. They're constantly dealing with short-term health issues, and those that need chronic care either don't get it or have to leave for treatment, which requires residents to apply for a permit to leave Gaza that is notoriously difficult to obtain. If you are 17 years old in Gaza, you have lived your entire life under blockade and survived 7 deadly wars. Although I was born and raised in the United States, my parents are both from Gaza. As a child, I became well acquainted with my homeland, unfortunately not through vacations to the region and visits to my family, but through the TV, watching segment after segment of settlement expansions, invasions, riots, military blockades, peace talks, president's addresses, and so on and so forth. I watched my father mourn the death of his father here, alone, as he had no way of going to Gaza for his funeral due to the border closure. I witnessed all happy moments like family weddings, births, graduation celebrations, all from afar, because we could not risk going to Gaza for fear of not being able to leave. As a child, I internalized a lot of my longing for the homeland, as it seemed to be the only place in the world that was off limits to me, even though I had a right to the land. While my peers in school were spending their summer break in Israel and Tel Aviv and preparing to take their birthright trips at 18 years old, I was forced to resort to learning about my land, my people, my family, from the confines of a phone. Although my parents embedded in me a deep sense of pride of where I come from and who I am, being in America, we were always taught to be cautious, not to be too loud or take up too much space for fear of repercussions. I spent the majority of my life trying to prove my humanity and the humanity of the Palestinian people. I realized early on that the duty of the Palestinian is to prove that we deserve the world's compassion and empathy, since we were always labeled as less than, to either be palatable or to be condemned. Now I want you to imagine for a minute, those of you on the left side of the room, half of the room, I'm ordering you to evacuate to the other side of the room. All exits are blocked. The middle path between you is actively being bombed. The road is cracked and unwalkable. Your life, your family's life, on the line for the mere chance at safety. And even the shelter you arrive at is then bombed. No place is safe. On October 13th, after 1 week of relentlessly carpet bombing the most populated areas in Gaza, Israel warned residents north of the Gaza Valley to evacuate to the south of the valley. That is half the population, 1.1 million people, that were asked to leave everything they have and make their way to the south of the Strip, otherwise risking that they would be bombed and killed. Many people tried to evacuate, while many stayed due to the lack of transportation or fuel, safety on the road, and many simply just did not want to leave their homes. That day, while families packed their belongings and gathered their families to make the trek, they were deliberately targeted and were bombed in broad daylight. 70 people were killed, following evacuation orders where they were told that they would find safety. No place is safe in Gaza. Not the UN schools where tens of thousands of people were taking shelter in, not the hospitals, not even churches or mosques. Parents are writing their children's names and ID numbers on their arms and legs. And in the case that they are killed and there's no one to identify them. To date, more than 7,700 civilians, and that number is climbing as we speak, have been killed. And more than half of those civilians are children alone. There are thousands of people still under the rubble that rescuers can't reach, especially in the past 48 hours where internet and phone services were completely cut off. Ambulances, excavators, hospitals, no one could communicate in order to find out where homes were being bombed so that they could go and tend to the emergency. Imagine neighbors and survivors rushing their dead to the hospital in their arms and whatever transportation they could find to tell EMTs where in the neighborhood there was a bombing so that they could go and tend to the casualties. You must understand the volume of how much this is a humanitarian catastrophe, a modern genocide. No clean water, no food, no electricity, no fuel, no supplies, no access to the outside world, and no exit. I was finally able to get in contact with my cousin, my aunt's daughter, after 48 hours of a complete connection blackout last night. The first thing that she asked me was, "What are the updates? Has there been a ceasefire?" Imagine, she is turning to me, her cousin in America, to give her the news about what is happening in her country, in her neighborhood. This same cousin is almost 9 months pregnant with her first child and was scheduled to have a C-section and now does not know what she's going to do. I was just in Gaza this time last year. I spent significant time there making up for lost time. I got to know my family, dozens of cousins. I answered the same question over and over. Which place do you like more, Palestine or the United States? And would be met with disbelief every single time I answered Palestine. I was blessed to get to know my grandmother, Aisha, who was almost 100 years old, who never left her homeland, and even within her land was made a foreigner as she was never able to travel to neighboring cities and see the beauty it has to offer. I made so many friends there that were so delighted to show me my home, to show me the beauty that we have to offer. Now, day and night, I check for any updates of whether or not they are alive. I have already lost family members that I never even had the luxury of meeting. Gaza is the most beautiful place that I have ever visited. Its people are resilient, their faith steadfast. The soil itself speaks when you walk on it. I'm devastated for those that lost their lives, but I, along with everyone who lives there, are truly perplexed as to how we can move on from this. How, if when, will we rebuild? How can we cope with the loss? The only thing that Palestinians ask of us is to tell their story, to share what is happening to them while the world watches. We are failing them. It is hard to not be paralyzed by the grief. We Palestinians have not been granted the luxury to even grieve the dead, to grieve the memories and precious lives that will come. The Zionist regime wants us to fall into our own suffering and despair, to lose hope and surrender. But Palestinians are stronger than that. Their objective is failing. I will end with an excerpt from an op-ed that was published in the New York Times, written by Dr. Hala Alayan, titled, "Why Must Palestinians Audition for Your Sympathy?" She says, "In the past couple of weeks, I've watched Palestinian activists, lawyers, professors get baited and interrupted on air, if not silenced altogether. They are being made to sing for the supper of airtime and fair coverage. They are begging reporters to do the most basic tasks of their job. At the same time, Palestinians fleeing from bombs have been misidentified. Even when under attack, they must be costumed as another people to elicit humanity. Even in death, they cannot rest. Palestinians are being buried in mass graves or in old graves dug up to make room, and there's still not enough space. If that were not enough, Palestinian slaughter is too often presented ahistorically, untethered to reality. It is not attributed to the real steel and missiles, to occupation, to policy, to earn compassion for their dead. Palestinians must prove their innocence. The real problem with condemnation is the quiet, sly tenor of the questions that accompany it. Palestinians are presumed violent and deserving of violence until proven otherwise. Their deaths are presumed defensible until proved otherwise. What is a word of a Palestinian against a machinery that investigates itself, that absolves itself of accused crimes? What is it against a government whose representatives have referred to Palestinians as human animals and wild beasts? When a well-suited man can say brazenly and unflinchingly that there is no such thing as a Palestinian people. It is, of course, a remarkably effective strategy. A slaughter isn't a slaughter if those being slaughtered are at fault. If they've been quietly and effectively dehumanized in the media through policy for years. If nobody is a civilian, nobody can be a victim. Here's another thing I know as a writer and psychologist. It matters where you start a narrative. In addiction work, we call this playing the tape. Diasporically or not, being Palestinian is the quintessential disruptor. It messes with a curated, modified tape. We exist, and our existence presents an existential affront. As long as we exist, we challenge several falsehoods, not the least of which is that for some, we never existed at all. Our very existence challenges a formidable militarized narrative. But the days of the Palestine exception are numbered. Palestine is increasingly becoming the litmus test for true liberatory practice. In the meantime, Palestinians continue to be cast paradoxically, both terror and invisible, both people who never existed and people who cannot return. Imagine being such a pest, such an obstacle, or imagine being so powerful. Now, I don't hesitate for a second to condemn the killing of any child, any massacre of civilians. It is the easiest ask in the world. And it is not in spite of that, but because of that, I say, condemn the brutalization of bodies. By all means do. Condemn murder, condemn violence, imprisonment, all forms of oppression. But if your shock and distress comes only at a sight of a certain brutalized bodies, if you speak out, but not when Palestinian bodies are besieged and murdered, abducted and imprisoned, then it is worth asking yourself which brutalization is acceptable to you, even quietly, even subconsciously, and which is not. Name the discrepancy and own it. If you can't be equitable, be honest. There is nothing complicated about asking for freedom. We need to pressure our representatives to call for a ceasefire. We need to lift the siege. Israel needs to be held accountable for the countless war crimes it has and is currently committing. Don't stop talking about Palestine. Don't forget. This illegal occupation needs to end. Thank you.